Cities and towns are not only growing in size and number, they're also gaining new influence. The urban transition offers significant opportunities to improve the quality of life. But whether this potential is realized depends critically on how cities are managed and on the national and local policies affecting their development. The development of urban areas is also closely linked to the rural economy through the exchange of labor, goods, services, information, and technology. Neglecting urban issues leads to significant social and environmental costs, however. In the two most urbanized regions that the World Bank serves, Latin America and Europe, Central Asia, over half of the poor already live in urban areas. By 2025, 2/3 of the poor in these regions and 1/3 of the poor in East and South Asia will reside in cities or towns. The nature of urban poverty is more than an income or employment issue, and is also characterized by squalid living conditions, risks to life and health from poor sanitation, air pollution, crime and violence, traffic and natural shocks, such as the recent crisis in East Asia and Russia. Urban environmental degradation has the most immediate effects on poor urban residents, but also has serious national and global impacts. Historically, reasons for the migration of Asians to the United States were similar in some ways to those for the Atlantic migration of Europeans: to escape from poverty and civil war, and to find employment, opportunity, and freedom. Chinese laborers were recruited to build the Transcontinental Railroad in the mid-19th century and provide domestic services in cities such as San Francisco. They were followed by the Japanese and Filipinos in the early 20th century, who labored in Alaskan canneries. Of these early Asian Americans, only the Japanese were allowed to immigrate as families at the insistence of the Japanese government. For these early generations, Asians in America were largely bachelor communities of temporary sojourners, with male-to-female ratios as high as 10-1. Asian American children in those early years were rare. Since 1970, the demography of this population has changed tremendously. In 2002, Asian Americans were slightly more than 4% of the U.S. population. The growth of the Asian American population since 1970 is due in great part to the elimination of exclusionary immigration policies that existed before 1965. Implementation of new refugee statutes directly flowing from the Vietnam War, and the rise of second and subsequent U.S.-born generations. In 1970, there were 1.5 million Asian Americans. This amounts to an 8-fold to 9-fold increase in little more than 30 years. Coca-Cola has bucked the trend for celebrity-fronted advertising by choosing a virtually unknown British artist to front one of its biggest UK campaigns. While arch-rival Pepsi features the likes of David Beckham and Beyoncé Knowles in its campaigns, Coca-Cola has hired the Basement Jaxx vocalist Charlene Hector to star in its first-ever UK branding campaign for Coca-Cola Classic. The advert breaks tomorrow and features Hector singing the Nina Simone classic I Wish as she walks through the streets distributing bottles of Coca-Cola. It is the latest in the company's new Real campaign, which took over from the Always Coca-Cola adverts and is aimed at giving the brand a more irreverent image. The actress Penelope Cruz has appeared belching after drinking Coke in adverts in the U.S. The new advertising is the first campaign to be created by the quirky British advertising agency Mother, which won the Coca-Cola business last year after pitching against the company's pitching U.S. agency, McCann Erickson. The agency had already created campaigns for Coca-Cola-owned created Lilt, Oasis, and Schweppes, and was charged with coming up with a specifically British approach to the world's best-known brand. The strategy is part of the Coca-Cola chairman and chief executive Douglas Daft's so-called Think Local, Act Local philosophy, inspired by the realization that what works for American philosophy will not necessarily succeed elsewhere. Crime in the United States accounts for more death, injuries, and loss of property than all natural disasters combined. The Disaster Center is pleased to be able to provide you with access to the statistics of crime, compiled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When you experience a crime, it can make you respond in ways that you might not understand. In that crisis situation, you may react in ways that conflict with the assumptions you've created about yourself. At the end of the crime, you may feel a sense of helplessness, fear, and anger. Afterward, you may have a hard time relating the experience to the context of the assumptions of your life. A conflict often develops between your idea of the world before the crime and your idea of the world after the disaster. On top of this, the victims and their relatives often experience financial problems, and time is often lost from work to handle the legal, insurance, and personal problems associated with being a victim. The trauma associated with any crime often makes it hard for victims to cope with normal daily routines, and the victims of crime are frequently blamed by their friends for not being more careful. The trauma continues as victims of crime often find themselves ignored by law enforcement and confused by the court system. Two horrifying crimes have exposed serious weaknesses in Connecticut's criminal justice system. But a 3 strikes and you're out law proposed by Governor 𝑳𝒊𝒂𝒄𝒓𝒊 and Republicans in the legislature would do more harm than good. Last July, 2 recently paroled men broke into a home in Cheshire and tortured and murdered 3 people. Last month, a man who served more than 8 years for assaulting a 5-year-old and had been out on probation for less than a month broke into a New Britain home. He accosted 2 women, wounding one and killing the other. Republicans, led by Ms. Rell, have responded by calling for a 3 strikes law. Democrats have rightly resisted. The proposed law, which would mandate life in prison for anyone convicted of 3 violent felonies, is a bumper sticker solution that would create injustices by barring judges' discretion in sentencing. It would also not deter the many crimes committed by people who have not committed 3 violent felonies. Governor Rell and the Democrats do agree on the need for other urgent reforms, including more reentry programs and job training, and better monitoring after prisoners are released on probation and parole. Connecticut has 2,500 parolees, but a staggering 55,000 people on probation. Probation officers handle an average of 107 cases each, far too many. Connecticut's system for sharing crime information, which could keep some of the most dangerous offenders off the streets, is antiquated. It has neither inpatient treatment for sex offenders, nor housing for them once they're released. Hundreds of former inmates are on a waiting list for inpatient drug treatment. The suspect arrested in the New Britain case had been staying in a homeless shelter at night but roaming freely during the day while waiting to begin outpatient sex offender treatment. Returning released inmates to society with so little support makes no sense. Most observers tend to extrapolate current trends and assume that what we see now will continue moving in the same direction, ever larger cities, etc. I don't see it that way. The global energy predicament now, gathering around us, will synergize with climate change to produce a very different outcome. I think we'll eventually see a reversal of the 200-year-long cycle of people moving from farms and small towns to big cities. Food production is going to be a big problem when oil and gas-based agriculture is no longer possible. And we will have to re-establish a more meaningful relationship between urban places and a more productive agricultural hinterland. Our megacities will contract substantially. The fortunate ones will densify around their old cores and waterfronts, though sea level rise may affect many harbor cities. This process of contraction is likely to be problematic and disorderly. In America, there's certainly the potential for ethnic conflict. Categorically, our colossal metroplexes will not be sustainable in a post-oil future, and despite the wishes and yearnings of many people, the truth is that no combination of alternative fuels will permit us to continue living at this scale. Some of our cities will not make it. Phoenix, Tucson, and other Sunbelt cities will dry up and blow away. In Las Vegas, the excitement will be over. Other megacities will have to downscale or face extreme dysfunction. One thing that almost nobody is paying attention to: the skyscraper will not be a viable building type in our energy-scarce future. 6 or 7 stories must be the practical limit in a new age when electric supply is not necessarily as reliable as it has been in our time. Cities overburdened with megastructures will have a severe liability. The headlines tell us that the world is now more urban than rural. Surely this fact ought to have profound consequences that call for new attitudes and public policies. However, as is often the case with profound change, what actually is happening and how we should view these changes is extremely murky. From one point of view, the vast migration of people from the countryside to the city is simply the latest chapter in a story that has played out worldwide over the last several centuries. First in the most affluent nations of the West, and now in the developing world, as more efficient agriculture has reduced the number of people needed in the fields. The rise of new urban economies has drawn them to cities. Every time this push-pull phenomenon has shifted into high gear, whether in London in the 19th century or in Mumbai today, and have often backfired because they've tried to control behavior rather than plan for it. In the long run, however, the policies were probably less important than the eventual result: an equally massive move from the cities back into the countryside. In virtually every affluent nation on the earth, the old 19th century industrial cities have exploded outward, allowing densities to plummet at the core as residents move further and further out into low-density suburbia, and a very low-density exurban penumbra around that. The city of Paris today has a third fewer residents than it did a century ago, and the suburban and exurban territory around it leapfrogs more or less from the English Channel to Burgundy. In this process, the very distinction between urban and rural has all but disappeared, as citizens in almost every part of affluent societies are able to participate in what is essentially an urban culture.
There are few among us that did not wonder in awe about what it would be like to be an astronaut. Space exploration will forever pique humanity's interest and curiosity. The prestige of visiting outer space belongs to a proud few, but as technology develops, more and more people will have the opportunity. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale states that a man or a woman officially becomes an astronaut upon reaching an altitude of over 100 miles. As of March 30th, 2006, 443 people have crossed this imaginary line. Efforts to learn more about space are widespread. Since the astronaut Yuri Gagarin made his pioneering exit out of our atmosphere, men and women from 35 countries have joined his notoriety. During the race to space in the early 1960s, the United States began Project Apollo, a campaign launched to compete with the efforts of Russian scientists and future cosmonauts. With resources going to the Apollo spacecraft, Saturn launch vehicle, and details like mission-specific astronaut suits, the U.S. was finally successful when the Apollo astronauts reached the moon and safely returned in July of 1969. Since the infancy of human presence in space, 18 astronauts have died on missions, and 10 more from launches. Despite this, our interests remain strong and our minds stay determined. Find out more about astronauts and space-related news in our archive of astronaut pictures, articles, and interactive features below. Modern wealth has been created mainly through the action of market forces, which now dominate the whole of the industrial world. It is based on the false premise that we all start at an equal point. Of course, nobody starts at the same point. Market forces help a few to become very wealthy at the expense of the many who become poorer. This is taking place all over the world. There is an increasing number of hungry and desperate people living in utter poverty, yet there are millionaires of all nationalities throughout the developed world. Market forces are inevitably acting to divide our world because they separate one section of society from another. Strangely enough, to create a society based on the free play of market forces, there must be a very strict control over the economy to ensure business efficiency. This is the poison of commercialization. It imposes restrictions on the natural needs of society. When the politicians are not meeting the needs of society, the people revolt. When the people's voice is not heard, there will inevitably be a revolution. Part of that revolution is the growing crime rate and the violent street protests, which are the result of the imbalance of our society. Too great wealth side by side with too great poverty. Spring wedding season has arrived, ushering in hefty costs for guests, and especially for members of the wedding party. But it can be hard for 20-somethings to fit extra costs into scant budgets, especially if you have multiple weddings to attend. So be sure to determine what you are signing up for before committing to be part of the ceremony or a guest at a destination wedding, and look for ways to trim costs. If you are asked to be a part of a ceremony, don't hesitate to ask the bride and groom up front for details, including the event's location and other functions they may expect you to attend. In return, be honest with them about your financial situation. Colleen Bayust, 24, attended 4 weddings last year, traveling from Washington to Boston, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, a total of 7 times for dress fittings, bachelorette parties, and the ceremonies. It really added up. I had to tell my friend in Boston that I didn't have the money to attend her bachelorette party in Manhattan, she says. If you know you can't afford to fly to a destination wedding in the Caribbean, plus a weekend bridal party in Miami, speak up from the beginning, says Susan Rowan, a networking and etiquette expert in San Francisco. It's fair to say I love you, but I don't want to shortchange you if I can't afford to participate in every aspect, she says. China will become the world's safest and largest investment economy in times to come, given the following factors: huge market potential, rich labor resources, comparative advantage in labor cost, sound corporate governance, and stable government and society. All these factors will further attract the inflow of foreign capital into China. In short, China's economy will grow even faster in the future. In the next 15 years, China's economy will still increase at a rate of 7% to 8%. In the year 2020, should price index remain the same as today, GDP will amount to US $4.8 trillion. GDP per capita will reach US $3,300. However, the level of GDP per capita is still very low in China at the moment. GDP per capita's growth is still at a slow rate. GDP per capita will have to be further increased in order to raise China's standard of living so as to bridge the present income gap between the rich and the poor. Satisfaction of consumers' needs can be the main driver in raising China's living standards. Domestic demand will increase as the economy grows. Therefore, extensive production of goods and services can further push and sustain the economy's growth. Moreover, there are abundant human resources in China, and labor cost in China is much lower than the other industrialized countries. China's education system is also being fast developed. Thus, more people will achieve higher level of education than in the past. With comparative advantage in cheap labor cost and increase of human capital brought about by education, future for China's economy can be only even brighter. Most patients with type 2 diabetes should start taking statins, the cholesterol-fighting drugs, as a preventative measure against heart disease, whether or not they have high cholesterol levels according to new guidelines released yesterday. The recommendations from the American College of Physicians call for moderate doses of statins by people with diabetes who are older than 55, and for younger patients who have any other risk factors for heart disease, like high blood pressure or history of smoking. The new guidelines are outlined in April 20th issue of the Annals of Internal Medicine, in an article that noted that about 16 million Americans have type 2 diabetes, and that 800,000 new cases are diagnosed every year. The lead author of an article accompanying the guidelines, Dr. Sandeep Vijan of the University of Michigan, said that almost everyone with type 2 diabetes should be on a statin. The average age at diagnosis is 48, And even many patients under 55 have high blood pressure as well as diabetes, he said. Traditionally, diabetes treatment has focused on regulating blood sugar levels by careful control of diet or through insulin injections. But researchers have come to understand that control sugar really protects only against the destruction of small blood vessels, which can lead to blindness or loss of fingers, toes, or limbs. Heart disease is, in fact, the more serious threat. Up to 80% of diabetes patients will develop heart problems or die of them, the article said. And Dr. Vijan emphasized that controlling hypertension remained the highest priority. He ranked control of lipids, the fats in the bloodstream that can affect coronary health, second ahead of glucose regulation. Fighting in Afghanistan and Pakistan meant that polio eradication did not go well in those countries in 2007, a World Health Report said last week. They are two of the last 4 nations that have not eliminated the disease. In Afghanistan, most cases were in southern provinces under Taliban control. In Pakistan, many were in the remote tribal border areas where Osama bin Laden is still being pursued, and local militants are battling the government. Polio experts see the territory differently, as one epidemiological block with 2 transmission corridors, one in the mountainous north where cases of the polio strain known as type 1 are common, and one in the flatter south where type 3 prevails. Tribes migrate east-west across the borders, following harvests, trade routes, and jobs. Polio went as far southeast as Karachi, where there is no fighting, but immunization drives remain weak, the report said. Crowded slums and petty corruption disrupt efforts, an expert said. The report spoke of a breakthrough in August when the Taliban started letting vaccinators work in their territory. We dialogue with NATO and tell them, these are the days of our campaigns. These are our people. Don't bomb them, said Dr. Bruce Aylward, the campaign's director. Eradication requires mustering thousands of health workers every few months to visit homes and give vaccine drops to every child under 5. Both countries tried to vaccinate their whole populations 4 times in 2007, and each held 7 regional drives.
The Internet revolution is yet to happen in India, like the way it has happened with cell phones and cable TV. While it's common to see everyone from auto drivers to senior citizens with cell phones, you will rarely find an auto driver who visits a cyber cafe to check his email. This has to do with opportunity cost involved in spending time in cyber cafes, and most importantly, the lack of services to target a large part of India. The Internet too largely uses American Standard Code for information interchange. This alienates many communities from the boon of computers and Internet. The fact remains that most of India's billion people are denied access to the Internet, and not only because they don't have a connection or a computer. The digital revolution is leaving them behind because they don't speak English, the dominant language of the web. Even if there is room for further growth among English language users in India, far greater growth could be unleashed. Hindi is the world's 3rd or 4th most widely spoken language. Yet it is not even in the top 10 languages on the Internet. A recent trend of regional content is preferred by more and more Internet users. It is recognized that the content has to be in a language that is understood by many users. In the Internet space, this is highly unbalanced currently. 12 out of 6,000 popular languages spoken globally account for 98% of web content, with English most prominent among them. In its short life, the Internet has become an agent of revolutionary change and is one of the fastest tools to promote and defend freedom and to facilitate democratic access to information and knowledge. It has emerged as one of today's greatest instruments of progress and has gradually become a part of the vital infrastructure of global social, economic, cultural, and political life. The Internet's effect on our lives is pervasive. Over the past decade, the use of email, the web, and blogs have become part of the daily routine of more than 1 billion Internet users. Today, the Internet access touchpoints have outgrown the traditional PC-based Internet browsers, Internet Explorer, Firefox, to desktop applications, mobile phones, and satellite navigational devices in vehicles and living rooms. More and more people are buying movie tickets, air tickets, travel packages, railway tickets, and paying bills online. Online gaming is projected to increase by 141% by 2011 in the Asia-Pacific region, and mobile gaming to increase by 119% by a leading gaming industry. Very soon, we will see the dawn of the video age, when video will be used for buying, communicating, learning, and socializing. Online chat and blogs are reducing the gap between private and public life of the present generation. Cyber cafes have taken over pubs and bars for socializing, in spite of the opposing forces of regional borders, copyright, censorship, network blocking, etc. Three basic ingredients are required for a thunderstorm to form: moisture, rising unstable air, and a lifting mechanism. The sun heats the surface of the earth, which warms the air above it. If this warm surface air is forced to rise, it will continue to rise as long as it weighs less and stays warmer than the air around it. As the air rises, it transfers heat from the surface of the earth to the upper levels of the atmosphere. The water vapor it contains begins to cool, releasing the heat, and it condenses into a cloud. The cloud eventually grows upward into areas where the temperature is below freezing. Some of the water vapor turns to ice, and some of it turns into water droplets. Both have electrical charges. Ice particles usually have positive charges, and rain droplets usually have negative charges. When the charges build up enough, they're discharged in a bolt of lightning, which causes the sound waves we hear as thunder. On the 7th of February 2008, thunderstorms ripped through the eastern parts of Australia. Winds gusting over 90 kilometers an hour brought down trees on houses, power lines, and roads. The city of Perth, Western Australia, had its wettest February since 1992, when more than 40 millimeters of heavy rain fell and caused a 50-day drought to end. The proportion of greenhouse gases has increased significantly since the Industrial Revolution. Humans began burning fossil fuels, particularly coal, in a big way to drive steam engines for industry and generate electricity. In addition to escalating coal use after the Industrial Revolution, there came the widespread use of another fossil fuel, petroleum for transport. At the beginning of the 20th century, annual global oil output was about 150 million barrels of oil. Now, that amount is extracted globally in just 2 days. Fossil fuels are classed as non-renewable sources of energy, formed from decayed plants and animals over hundreds of millions of years. Burning fossil fuels releases billions of tons of carbon dioxide that has been locked away in the earth for millions of years. Humans are adding billions of tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere each year. And guess what? Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. The rate at which the planet is warming is possibly the biggest challenge to ever face humanity. The impacts are likely to be devastating. We need to act decisively and act now. A single web page cannot fully answer the question of what global warming is. Following the links on this page will allow you to see how complex and serious the issue of global warming is. So, what is global warming? It is a disaster of our own making. Randy considers the YMCA her lifeline, especially the pool. Randy weighs more than 300 pounds and has borderline diabetes, but she controls her blood sugar and keeps her bright outlook on life by swimming every day for about 45 minutes. Randy overcame any self-consciousness about her weight for the sake of her health, and those who swim with her and share the open locker room are proud of her. If only the millions of others beset with chronic health problems recognized the inestimable value to their physical and emotional well-being of regular physical exercise. The single thing that comes close to a magic bullet in terms of its strong and universal benefits is exercise. Frank Hu, epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health, said in the Harvard magazine, "I've written often about the protective roles of exercise. It can lower the risk of heart attack, stroke, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, depression, dementia, osteoporosis, gallstones, diverticulitis, falls, erectile dysfunction, peripheral vascular disease, and 12 kinds of cancer. But what if you already have one of these conditions, or an ailment like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, congestive heart failure, or osteoarthritis? How can you exercise if you're always tired or in pain or have trouble breathing? Can exercise really help? You bet it can. Marilyn Moffitt, a professor of physical therapy at New York University and co-author with Carol B. Lewis of Age-Defying Fitness, conducts workshops for physical therapists around the country and abroad, demonstrating how people with chronic health problems can improve their health and quality of life by learning how to exercise safely. In years past, doctors were afraid to let heart patients exercise. When my father had a heart attack in 1968, he was kept sedentary for 6 weeks. Now, heart attack patients are in bed barely half a day before they're up and moving. Dr. Moffitt said, "The core of cardiac rehab is a progressive exercise program to increase the ability of the heart to pump oxygen and nutrient-rich blood more effectively throughout the body. The outcome is better endurance, greater ability to enjoy life, and decreased mortality. The same goes for patients with congestive heart failure. Heart failure patients as old as 91 can increase their oxygen consumption significantly," Dr. Moffitt said. Aerobic exercise lowers blood pressure in people with hypertension, and it improves peripheral circulation in people who develop cramping leg pains when they walk. a condition called intermittent claudication. The treatment for it, in fact, is to walk a little farther each day. In people who have had transient ischemic attacks or mini-strokes, gradually increasing exercise improves blood flow to the brain and may diminish the risk of a full-blown stroke, Dr. Moffitt said, and aerobic and strength exercises have been shown to improve endurance, walking speed, and the ability to perform tasks of daily living up to 6 years after a stroke. As Randy knows, moderate exercise cuts the risk of developing diabetes. And for those with diabetes, exercise improves glucose tolerance. Less medication is needed to control blood sugar and reduces the risk of life-threatening complications. It is a remarkable reversal in attitudes from just a few months ago, when the broader economy seemed relatively healthy, but Wall Street was traumatized by billions of dollars in mortgage-related losses. Now, bankers and investors appear ready to look past the crisis to more profitable times, while consumers find themselves in a more precarious position as the job market weakens and banks make it harder to borrow money. It is, of course, not uncommon for Wall Street to run ahead of the broader economy. Investors, after all, make money by anticipating the future. The job market, by contrast, improves more slowly than other aspects of the economy. But specialists say the two sides will eventually converge. Either the markets will give up their recent gains, or, if the optimists are right, the broader economy will show greater strength as tax rebate checks and lower interest rates stimulate the economy. There have been false dawns before. Last spring, after several mortgage companies collapsed, Mr. Paulson and the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben S. Bernanke, said the problems appear to be contained. In early October, just 2 months after credit markets froze up, the stock market climbed to an all-time high. The optimists believe it is different this time. The catalyst for change, they say, was the Fed-arranged deal that sold a troubled investment bank, Bear Stearns, to J.P. Morgan Chase in mid-March. The central bank further restored order in the markets by lending directly to investment banks, assuring that big securities firms could not be undone by a crisis of confidence.
To figure out these counterintuitive findings, the researchers conducted an experiment in a hotel room. They rounded up some lizards, gave them a perch, and then used a leaf blower to mimic the effects of high winds. They set up a net to catch any lizards that lost their grip. As the artificial wind blew, the lizards moved so the perch took most of the airflow. But their hind legs would stick out, and if those rear limbs stuck out too far, they acted as sails.
Eventually, those back legs were blown off the perch, and the lizards were just holding on with their front 2 legs. And they could only hold on like that for so long as the wind speeds increased further and further until eventually they were blown off the perch and into the nets.
So shorter back legs gave a survival advantage, a trait that might be passed on to the next lizard generation.
Crows, she says, are what's known as partial migrants. Every year, some members of the population migrate between breeding grounds and their overwintering grounds, like parking lots. But others just stay put. So Townsend and her colleagues wanted to know if that urge to migrate was something individual crows can turn on and off. To find out, they captured 18 crows from overwintering spots in California and New York. They fitted the birds with little backpack satellite tags and tracked them for several years. Overall, 3/4 of the birds migrated, an average of 300 miles. And more importantly, if they migrated once, they did it every year, suggesting traveling is not a habit they switch on and off. The researchers also found that migrating crows returned faithfully to the same breeding grounds every year, but they were more flexible on where to overwinter, which could be a good thing. Abandoned pueblos are scattered throughout the southwestern U.S., and at many, archaeologists have uncovered a curious artifact, the skeletons of scarlet macaws. The bird's bright red feathers are known to have been an important status symbol, a signifier of prestige, for people throughout the American tropics and the Southwest, both in the ancient world and today. But macaws are a tropical bird, whose range never extended north of today's U.S.-Mexico border. So how did the Pueblo people obtain the birds? To examine the bird's origin, scientists sequenced mitochondrial DNA found within macaw bones from 2 sites in New Mexico, Chaco Canyon and the Mimbres region. Turns out nearly 3/4 of the birds had identical mitochondrial genome sequences, meaning the ancient birds came from the same maternal line. That suggests they were all the products of a breeding operation, perhaps in modern-day northern Mexico, rather than a random collection of wild-caught birds. Brooke and her colleague Mark Newman studied who swapped messages with whom on a popular online dating platform in the month of January 2014. They categorized users by desirability using PageRank, one of the algorithms behind search technology. Essentially, if you receive a dozen messages from desirable users, you must be more desirable than someone who receives the same number of messages from average users. And then they asked, how far out of their league do online daters tend to go when pursuing a partner?
I think people are optimistic realists.
In other words, they found that both men and women tended to pursue mates just 25% more desirable than themselves.
So they're being optimistic, but they're not. They're also taking into account their own relative position within this overall desirability hierarchy.
And the study did have a few more lessons for people on the market.
I think one of the take-home messages from the study is women could probably afford to be more aspirational in their mate pursuit.
Well, in 2004, we integrated ticketing in southeast Queensland. So we introduced a paper ticket that allowed you to travel across all the 3 modes in southeast Queensland, so bus, train and ferry. And the second stage of integrated ticketing is the introduction of a smart card. And the smart card will enable people to store value, so to put value on the card and then to use the card for travelling around the system.
For the first time, Japanese researchers have conducted a real-life experiment that shows how some traffic jams appear for no apparent reason. They placed the 22 vehicles on a single track and asked the drivers to cruise around at a constant speed of 30 kilometers an hour. At first, traffic moved smoothly, but soon the distance between cars started to vary, and vehicles clumped together at one point on the track. But the jam spread backward around the track like a shockwave at a rate of about 20 kilometers an hour. Real-life jams move backward at about the same speed.
Hi, everybody. This is Joe Biden. I delivered a report to President Obama laying out how far we've come since he put me in charge of the cancer moonshot. That was back in January. And to lay out a real vision for where we need to go in the immediate future, to do in 5 years what otherwise would take 10, to inject a real sense of urgency into the fight against cancer, and to change the culture and reimagine our system in order to be able to win. You know, when President Nixon declared a war on cancer in 1971, he had no army, he had no resources, and no clear strategy. But after 45 years of progress, funding research, training scientists and physicians, and treating millions of patients, we now have an army, and we have tools, powerful tools. And with the moonshot, we now have a clear strategy for the road ahead. It matters, folks, because there's a consensus now that we're at an inflection point with science, medicine, technology, all advancing faster than ever and offering real promise. But we can't play by the rules of 1971 when we didn't have this working for us.
Hi, everybody. This weekend, we'll dedicate the newest American icon on our national mall, the National Museum of African American History and Culture. It's a beautiful building, 5 stories high and some 70 feet below the ground, situated just across the street from the Washington Monument. And this museum tells a story of America that hasn't always taken a front seat in our national narrative. As a people, we've rightfully passed on the tales of the giants who built this country, but too often, willful or not, we've chosen to gloss over or ignore entirely the experience of millions upon millions of others. But this museum chooses to tell a fuller story. It doesn't gauze up some bygone era or avoid uncomfortable truths. Rather, it embraces the patriotic recognition that America is a constant work in progress, that each successive generation can look upon our imperfections and decide that it is within our collective power to align this nation with the high ideals of our founding. There are a couple different stories you can tell about our economy. One goes like this. 8 years after the worst economic crisis of our lifetimes, our economy has created jobs for 71 straight months. That's a new record. Unemployment has fallen below 5%. Last year, the typical household saw its income grow by about $2,800, the biggest one-year increase ever. And the uninsured rate is at an all-time low. All that is true. What's also true is that too much of our wealth is still taken by the top. And that leaves too many families still working paycheck to paycheck without a lot of breathing room. There are 2 things we can do about this. We can prey on people's worries for political gain, or we can actually do something to help working families feel more secure in today's economy. Count me in the latter camp. And here's one thing that will help right away. Making sure more of our families have access to paid leave. Today, having both parents in the workforce is an economic necessity for many families. But right now, millions of Americans don't have access to even a single day of paid sick leave.
When the time comes, its peers should follow suit. Of these, the European Central Bank faces the trickiest challenge, because it has acted as, in effect, the backstop to Eurozone bond markets, a mechanism that otherwise the currency bloc still lacks. But the main safety valve lies elsewhere, with banks and investors. Bitter experience has shown that debt-funded assets can magnify losses, causing financial crises. For this reason, banks must be able to withstand any reversal of today's high asset prices and low defaults. That means raising bank capital in places where it is too low, especially the Eurozone, and not backsliding on strenuous stress tests, as America's Treasury proposes. In the end, however, there may be no escape for investors from the low future returns and even losses that high asset prices imply. They and regulators should take a leaf out of The Intelligent Investor and make sure that they have a margin of safety.
So a lot of the research on happiness starts with the basic question, how happy are you? And we're psychologists, so tell us on a scale of 1 to 10, where 5 is average, 10 is super duper. The most common answers, interestingly enough, are high. They're 7 or 8. It turns out that most people think that they're pretty happy. This question has been asked all over the world, and it turns out that there are slight differences depending on how old you are. There are slight differences depending on your place within a country. California versus New York. There are slight, subtle differences between men and women at different points. Somewhat paradoxically, although women are more vulnerable to depression than men, still, on average, women are slightly happier than men.
A really good illustrative example of the point I want to make is the book Journey Cake Ho by Ruth Sawyer, based on a traditional folk tale. Teachers often read this aloud to their classes, showing the pictures to the children as they do so. They are, of course, using the words of Ruth Sawyer and presenting the story just as the artist has visualized it. But other teachers do it differently. Instead of reading, they tell the story from memory. This gives the children a much richer experience. They can freely use their own imaginations, visualizing the story, the characters, and the scenes in their mind's eye in any way they like. And this is much closer to the way in which folk tales were passed from generation to generation, orally, without any words or pictures to restrict the imagination.
We'll look now at a very interesting study. It was carried out by a researcher who works in 2 countries, Scotland and Italy, and it involved children from both of these countries aged around 9 or so. Half of the children from each country spoke only their national language. However, the other half spoke their national language plus another language. During the study, all the participants were given tests and quizzes which looked at a range of skills, including vocabulary understanding, problem solving, creative thinking, and arithmetic. The children used their national language to complete the tasks, which involved things like copying patterns of coloured blocks, orally repeating a series of numbers, and giving clear definitions of words. The results were quite clear. The bilingual children were significantly more successful in the tasks.
People rarely translate another person's unique way of saying things with any degree of accuracy. This is because when we learn the meaning of words, we pick up their broad meanings, but we've added subtle shades of difference which we get from our own personal experiences. If you grew up in an aggressive household, the phrase, "I'm angry with you," had different associations than for a person from a family where people talked through problems. We're left having to work out meaning from our own experience. So, despite the fact that, say, Bob and Gina are both speaking English, Bob is really speaking Bob English, and Gina is turning that into Gina English, and the translation is never going to be perfect.
We miscommunicate more commonly than we communicate accurately. Often the words we have are at least somewhat inadequate to express how we feel. The first words we think of are often poor reflections of what we really mean. We might at times even want to take our words back for a second attempt. But once those words have left our mouths, our partners are already replying to whatever we have just said. Most conversations happen too fast to allow us to figure out what we really meant to say.
It's been a challenging decade for the music industry, with a significant decrease in sales. For years, little action was taken against illegal downloads, with few effects for downloaders. However, two new approaches are seeing positive results. Firstly, the industry is working with internet service providers to slow an illegal downloader's connection. Secondly, it's working directly with digital music websites. In Sweden, 3 out of 5 illegal file sharers have cut back or stopped, with half of these people moving to legal websites supported by advertisements.
Now, as you know already, there will be a midterm exam next week. The exam will be an open book, open note, and open internet resource exam. But you can't use a classmate or me during the exam. Many of the questions on this exam don't have definitive answers. I wish to assess your critical thinking ability and your ability to combine ideas. A poorly organized answer will not get the same grades as a well-organized answer. Here are some good ways to study for the exam. First of all, it would be better for you to organize and review your lecture notes. That means you may need to compile notes and lab test results if you have not done that already. I strongly suggest that you write trial outlines before the exam. I think it will make you feel more comfortable. Just stop by my office.